The air in the black cells beneath Winterbourne Palace did not merely feel cold, it felt violently opposed to the presence of human life. Located far below the freezing depths of the Black Lake, the dungeons were a masterpiece of ancient cruel architecture. Water dripped monotonously from the moss-choked stone arches, echoing like the ticking of a macabre clock, measuring the sanity of those locked within the heavy iron doors. Queen Eleanor descended the spiraling stone staircase. Her descent was marked by the steady, unhurried clicking of her velvet-heeled boots against the wet granite, accompanied by the heavy, rhythmic clanking of the Lord Commander's armor, just one step behind her. She did not wear the towering sovereign star tonight. The oppressive dampness of the cells was no place for absolute majesty. Instead, she wore a simple, yet impossibly elegant cloak of midnight wool, lined with black fox fur. It wrapped around her like a shadow. The Lord Commander paused before the final cell at the end of the corridor. He drew a massive rusted iron ring of keys from his belt. The sound of metal grinding against metal as he unlocked the heavy oak door was deafening in the subterranean silence. "She has not eaten the bread, Your Majesty." The Lord Commander murmured, his voice a gravelly whisper, pulling the heavy door open. "And she speaks only to threaten the guards." Eleanor did not reply. She simply raised a gloved hand, signaling the knight to remain in the corridor, and stepped over the threshold. The cell was a miserable cage of freezing stone and rotting straw. Huddled in the farthest corner, shivering violently beneath a thin woolen blanket, was Duchess Seraphina. The woman who had practically glided across the Great Hall just 48 hours ago, draped in stolen crimson velvet and dripping with black diamonds, was unrecognizable. Her spun gold hair was matted with filth and dampness. Her skin, once radiant, possessed the sickly, translucent pallor of a corpse. The remnants of her crimson gown, torn and soiled by the harsh reality of her arrest, hung off her shoulders like a tragic joke. Hearing the footsteps, Seraphina slowly lifted her head, her striking green eyes bloodshot and sunken, locked onto the Queen. For a moment, the heavy silence of the dungeon stretched between them. Then, a cracked, bitter sound escaped Seraphina's lips. It was a laugh, dry and devoid of humor. "Have you come to gloat?" Seraphina rasped, her voice trembling, ruined by the freezing air. She struggled to push herself up, leaning against the damp wall for support. "Have you come to watch me freeze, Eleanor?" Eleanor stood perfectly still. The flickering light from the corridor torch caught the subtle, icy contempt in her dark eyes. "I am the Queen of the Winter Realm," Eleanor said, her voice smooth, calm, and terrifyingly steady. It sounded incredibly loud in the small cell. "I do not waste my time gloating over vermin caught in a trap. I came to see if the reality of your treason had finally pierced your arrogance." Seraphina's lip curled into a desperate feral sneer. The mention of treason seemed to ignite a final, pathetic ember of defiance within her. "You think you have won?" The Duchess spat her breath, pluming in the freezing air. She clutched the thin blanket tighter around her shoulders. "You think stripping me of my title and throwing me in this rotting hole secures your crown? You are a fool." Eleanor tilted her head, slightly, the ghost of a cold smile playing on her lips. "Enlighten me, Seraphina." "My father," Seraphina hissed, her eyes wide with manic conviction, "Duke Sterling commands the largest naval fleet in the realm. He controls the southern grain, the very grain your pathetic freezing peasants need to survive the winter. Do you think he will simply allow you to execute his blood?" Seraphina had pushed herself off the wall, stumbling half a step forward, her voice rising to a hysterical pitch. "He will cut off the trade routes. He will barricade the narrow sea. He will starve Winterbourne Palace until the lords of this court drag you out of your bed by your hair, and beg him for a crust of bread. You have not broken me, Eleanor. You have just signed the death warrant of your own kingdom." Eleanor listened to the frantic outburst without a single shift in her posture. She watched the panicked, desperate creature before her, with the clinical detachment of a scholar observing a dying insect. When Seraphina finally ran out of breath, collapsing into a violent fit of shivering coughs, Eleanor took one deliberate step forward. The heavy rustle of her wool cloak sounded like the sweeping of a scythe. "Your father," Eleanor spoke, her tone dropping to a whisper that commanded absolute attention, "is a merchant masquerading as royalty. He measures loyalty in gold coins and power in bushels of wheat. You believe he will burn his own empire to save a daughter who was stupid enough to get caught. Seraphina froze, the coughing dying in her throat. A flicker of genuine doubt crossed her eyes, quickly masked by forced outrage. He loves me. I am his heir. He loves his ledgers, Eleanor corrected mercilessly. And you, my dear, have just become his greatest liability. Eleanor turned her back on the Duchess, the heavy fox fur of her cloak brushing the cold stone floor. She paused at the doorway, not looking back. Keep praying to the southern wind, Seraphina, the Queen said softly, the finality in her voice heavier than the iron door. But do not be surprised when the only thing they bring you is the scent of your own family's ruin. Eleanor stepped out into the corridor. Lock it, she commanded the Lord Commander. The heavy door slammed shut, cutting off Seraphina's sudden, terrified scream. By the time Queen Eleanor ascended from the dungeons and reached the heavy mahogany doors of the small council chamber, the atmosphere in the palace had shifted from residual shock to active panic. The chamber was located in the highest tower of the eastern wing, bathed in the pale, anemic light of the winter morning. A massive circular table of polished weirwood dominated the room, surrounded by the 12 highest-ranking lords of the realm. As Eleanor entered, the guards announced her presence, and the 12 lords practically leaped from their chairs, bowing deeply. King Alaric, seated at the head of the table in his heavy steel breastplate and dark tunic, did not stand, but his jaw tightened in acknowledgement. His icy blue eyes were stormy, fixed on a crumpled piece of thick parchment resting in the center of the table. Eleanor took her seat to the king's right, her movements deliberate and graceful. I trust the morning has brought news, my lords, she asked, her gaze sweeping over the nervous faces of the council. Lord Vance, the elderly Eastern Baron, who had been the first to kneel in the great hall, cleared his throat. He looked physically ill. Your Majesty, Vance began, his voice shaking. A raven arrived from the southern isles an hour before dawn. It bears the seal of Duke Sterling. And, Eleanor prompted, folding her gloved hands on the polished wood. King Alaric answered, his voice a low, terrifying growl that vibrated through the floorboards. He demands the immediate release of his daughter. He demands full pardons for her and the traitor, Harrington. And he demands that you, Eleanor, be stripped of the sovereign star and permanently exiled to the Silent Sisters for laying false charges against his blood. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the chamber. The sheer audacity of the demands was akin to declaring open war. Furthermore, Lord Vance squeaked out, terrified of the king's wrath. Duke Sterling has officially closed the southern ports. The grain fleet has been ordered to drop anchor in the archipelago. He states that not a single kernel of wheat will reach the mainland until his demands are met. Your Majesties, if the grain does not arrive within the fortnight, the outer provinces will begin to starve. Then we will feast on their carcasses, Alaric roared, finally slamming his massive scarred fist onto the table. The wood cracked under the impact, making several lords flinch violently. The king surged to his feet, his shadow looming over the terrified council. I will not be held hostage by a glorified grain merchant, Alaric bellowed, his hand resting instinctively on the hilt of his broadsword. I will call the banners. I will march the royal army down the King's Road, burn his ports to the sea, and personally sever Sterling's head from his shoulders. You will do no such thing, my king. The voice was not loud. It did not need to be. Eleanor's command cut through Alaric's explosive rage with the precision of a diamond cutting glass. Alaric whipped his head to look at her, his chest heaving. Eleanor, they are threatening to starve our people to protect a traitor. This is an act of war. It demands blood. It demands intellect, Eleanor corrected, her voice entirely unbothered by the rising panic in the room. She did not look at Alaric. She looked directly at Lord Vance. How many ships does Duke Sterling claim to command in this embargo? Vance swallowed hard. 200 galleons, Your Majesty. The largest merchant fleet in the known world. Eleanor smiled. It was the same chilling, lethal smile she had worn in the Great Hall. 200 ships, she mused softly, tracing the rim of her empty silver goblet. A formidable armada. It would be a terrible shame for Duke Sterling to discover that he does not actually own a single one of them. The royal study, located directly above the royal bedchambers, was an entirely different battlefield. It was a circular room built of ancient dark oak, lined from the polished floorboards to the vaulted ceiling with thousands of leather-bound tomes, scrolls, and historical decrees. The only source of light came from a massive hearth blazing against the eastern wall. and the heavy silver candelabras resting upon the Queen's massive mahogany desk. Outside the thick leaded glass windows, the winter storm howled like a wounded beast, hurling ice against the panes. It was 3 hours past midnight. King Alaric pushed open the heavy door, carrying a silver tray with 2 goblets of hot spiced wine. He had shed his heavy steel breastplate hours ago, though he still wore his dark woolen tunic and the heavy leather boots of a commander who expected a war to break out at any second. He found Eleanor exactly where he knew she would be. She was seated behind the sprawling desk illuminated by the golden halo of the candlelight. She had removed the heavy cloak from the dungeons, wearing a simple, high-collared gown of midnight blue. Her dark hair was unbound, cascading over her shoulders like a waterfall of ink. She was surrounded by a fortress of ancient crumbling ledgers, her elegant fingers stained with fresh black ink as she rapidly cross-referenced a stack of parchment. Alaric moved silently across the room, the thick Myrish rug absorbing his heavy footsteps. He set the tray down on the corner of the desk, the soft clink of silver finally drawing her attention. Eleanor looked up, the intense, terrifying focus in her obsidian eyes, softening just a fraction at the sight of him. She sighed, a delicate sound of pure exhaustion, and leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. "You should be resting, Alaric," she murmured, her voice stripped of the icy edge she weaponized for the court. "The sun will rise in 3 hours, and we have an empire to dismantle." "I could say the same to you," Alaric replied, picking up a goblet and walking around the desk. He stopped beside her chair, resting one large calloused hand gently on her shoulder. The heat radiating from his massive frame was a stark, comforting contrast to the freezing drafts of the castle. "You have been buried in these books since the small council meeting. The lords are terrified. Vance looks as though his heart might stop beating entirely." Eleanor accepted the second goblet he offered. She took a slow sip, letting the warmth of the spiced wine chase the chill from her chest. "Fear is a useful motivator for the nobility," she said softly, looking down at the sea of ledgers on her desk. "It reminds them why they need a strong monarchy. Duke Stirling's ultimatum was a gift, Alaric. It shattered the illusion of southern loyalty faster than I ever could have managed through audits alone." Alaric frowned, taking a deep drink from his own cup. The primal warrior inside him was still raging against the cage of her intricate strategy. "It does not feel like a gift. It feels like a siege. 200 ships blockading our southern ports, Eleanor. If the winter grain does not flow, the eastern and northern provinces will starve. I understand you have a plan, but sitting here waiting for this merchant to flex his power over us, it goes against everything I am." Eleanor turned her head, looking up into his stormy blue eyes. She understood his frustration. He was a king forged on the battlefield. When an enemy threatened his people, his instinct was to draw steel and charge into the blood and the mud. "I am not asking you to sit and wait, my king," Eleanor said, reaching up to cover the hand resting on her shoulder. "I am asking you to let the enemy walk onto the ice before you break it beneath their feet." She set her goblet down and turned her attention back to the desk. She pushed aside the newer clean ledgers of the royal treasury and pulled forward an entirely different set of books. These ledgers were old. They were bound in cracked black dragon leather and embossed with a single terrifying sigil in rusted iron, a crossed key, and a heavy gold coin. Alaric leaned closer, his eyes narrowing as he recognized the seal. "The Iron Bank of the Free Cities. Why do you have these?" "Because wealth, Alaric, is often the greatest illusion in the world," Eleanor explained, her voice dropping into the methodical, deadly cadence of a grandmaster explaining a checkmate. She opened the thickest ledger. The pages were covered in dense, meticulous ciphers that only a handful of master accountants in the realm could read. The court looks at Duke Stirling, and they see a god of commerce. She continued, tracing a line of ink with her fingernail. They see his fleets, his massive estates, and his diamond mines in the southern archipelago. They see a man so wealthy he believes he can dictate terms to the crown. And Alaric asked, the tension in his jaw tightening as he sensed the trap she had laid. "And it is all a lie," Eleanor whispered, looking up at him with a smile that lacked any mercy. To build that massive fleet to maintain his grip on the grain trade and fund Seraphina's pathetic delusions of grandeur, Duke Stirling required an impossible amount of gold. Gold he did not possess. Over the past 15 years, He has systematically mortgaged the entirety of the Southern Isles to the Iron Bank. Alaric's breath caught in his throat. He stared at the ledgers. You mean to tell me the wealthiest man in the Winter Realm is broke? Worse than broke, Eleanor corrected sharply. He is drowning. He leveraged his ports, his ships, and his land. The debt is astronomical, and the Iron Bank is not known for its patience. When I realized the extent of his corruption 3 years ago, I knew that simply auditing him would not be enough. If we pressed him, he would rebel just as he is doing now. To destroy him, we had to own him. She reached into a hidden drawer of her desk and pulled out a single heavily sealed parchment. It bore the massive, undeniable wax seal of the Master of the Iron Bank. During my 9 weeks of exile at Rosemont Castle, Eleanor said, handing the parchment to Alaric, I was not weeping over our fractured marriage. I was negotiating with the envoys from across the narrow sea. I used the royal treasury surplus combined with my own family's ancestral wealth, and I bought Duke Sterling's debt in its entirety. Alaric read the document, his icy blue eyes widening in absolute shock. The numbers written on the page were staggering enough to buy and sell half the continent, but the final clause was what made his blood run cold. Asterisk, the bearer of this deed holds absolute dominion over the assets, lands, and titles of the House of Sterling, to be called upon at the bearer's discretion in the event of default. Alaric looked slowly from the parchment to his wife. The sheer scale of her intellect, the terrifying depth of her foresight, hit him like a physical blow. He doesn't know. Alaric breathed absolute awe bleeding into his voice. Sterling thinks he is blockading the crown. He thinks he is starving us out. He thinks he is a wolf. Eleanor agreed softly, standing up from her chair. She moved closer to Alaric, her hands resting flat against the heavy wool of his tunic. He does not realize he is simply a dog barking at the end of a very long chain. A chain I am holding. Alaric dropped the parchment onto the desk and wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest. The protective fury in him had vanished, replaced by a profound, chilling exhilaration. So when his envoy arrives tomorrow to demand your exile and his daughter's release? Alaric began a dark, predatory smile slowly spreading across his face. You will let him speak, Eleanor commanded softly, her dark eyes glittering with dangerous light. You will let him threaten us in front of the entire court. You will let him lay his treason bare for all the lords to see, and then my king. She reached up her fingers, tracing the silver scar on his jawline. You will let me pull the chain. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The great hall of Winterbourne Palace was practically humming with terror by mid-morning. The heavy winter sunlight pierced the high vaulted windows, casting long, stark shadows across the marble floor. The entire nobility of the realm had been summoned. 300 lords, ladies, and ministers stood in tightly packed ranks, whispering frantically behind gloved hands. The rumors of the southern grain blockade had spread like a plague through the castle overnight. Panic was a tangible scent in the air, thick and suffocating. At the far end of the hall, elevated on the royal dais, King Alaric and Queen Eleanor sat upon their thrones. They were a terrifying portrait of absolute unyielding power. Alaric wore his full military regalia, the heavy iron and diamond peaks of the winter crown resting upon his brow, his broadsword strapped to his hip. Eleanor, defying the panic of the court, wore an exquisite heavy gown of deep emerald velvet, the color of a winter pine embroidered with silver threads. Upon her head sat the sovereign star, the ancient platinum and sapphires catching the morning light like shards of ice. They did not speak. They did not attempt to soothe the terrified nobility. They sat in glacial silence, waiting. The booming echo of the Master of Ceremonies' staff striking the marble floor finally shattered the whispers. Presenting Lord Reginald of House Sterling Prime, envoy of the Southern Isles. The massive bronze doors groaned open. The King's Guard, clad in their heavy silver armor, parted ranks to allow the envoy to enter. Lord Reginald was a man who wore his wealth like a weapon. He was dressed in thick, ostentatious layers of burnt orange silk and gold brocade despite the freezing temperature of the hall. Heavy gold chains hung around his thick neck, linking loudly with every arrogant step he took. He did not look like a man entering the stronghold of his king. He looked like a conqueror entering a defeated city. He marched down the center aisle, his chin raised completely, ignoring the terrified stares of the eastern and northern lords whose people he was currently threatening to starve. Reginald reached the base of the royal dais. He paused. Protocol dictated that an envoy must drop to one knee and bow his head before the king and queen. Lord Reginald did not kneel. He gave a shallow, insulting nod of his head. It was a calculated act of disrespect designed to show the court exactly who held the power in the room. A collective gasp rippled through the nobility. Several hands flew to the hilts of swords. King Alaric's grip on the armrests of his throne tightened until the carved oak groaned in protest. His icy blue eyes locked onto the envoy with the intensity of a predator, assessing the exact point to tear out its prey's throat. He felt Eleanor's presence beside him, a cool grounding anchor in the storm of his rage. Asterisk, let him speak. Your Majesty, Lord Reginald began, his voice booming, coated in a thick layer of oily arrogance. He addressed Alaric directly, entirely ignoring the Queen, seated just inches away. I bring urgent tidings from His Grace Duke Sterling of the Southern Isles. Tidings regarding the unfortunate misunderstanding that occurred in this very hall 2 nights ago. A misunderstanding. Alaric's voice was a low, dangerous rumble that echoed off the stone vaults. Your Duke's daughter and his bought and paid for Master of Coin were caught committing high treason against the crown. They are currently rotting in the black cells. I fail to see the misunderstanding, Lord Reginald. Reginald offered a patronizing smile, adjusting his heavy gold chains. Duke Sterling respectfully disagrees with the assessment of treason, Your Majesty. He believes that the Duchess Seraphina has been the victim of a vicious paranoid slander, orchestrated by a queen who feels threatened by younger, more capable blood. The silence in the great hall became absolute. To insult the queen directly to the king's face was madness. It was suicide. But Alaric did not draw his blade. He sat perfectly still, his face a mask of granite. Emboldened by the king's silence, Reginald withdrew a heavy parchment scroll from his robes. He unrolled it with a theatrical flick of his wrist. Duke Sterling is a reasonable man, Your Majesty, Reginald proclaimed loudly, ensuring every terrified lord in the room heard the ultimatum. He wishes for nothing but the continued prosperity of the Winter Realm. However, he cannot in good conscience allow his blood to be imprisoned on false charges. Therefore, he has instituted a temporary halt on all grain shipments leaving the southern ports. The court erupted into panicked whispers. Lord Vance looked as though he might faint. Reginald raised his voice over the noise. This halt will remain in effect until the following terms are met. 1. The immediate release and full pardon of Duchess Seraphina and Lord Harrington. 2. A formal public apology from the Crown to House Sterling. Reginald paused, a cruel, victorious sneer stretching across his face. He finally shifted his gaze to look directly at Queen Eleanor. And 3, the envoy declared, his voice dripping with venom. Queen Eleanor is to be immediately stripped of her titles, her crown, and her authority. She is to be banished to the Silent Sisters for the remainder of her natural life, for the crime of falsely accusing the noble house of Sterling. The great hall felt as though all the oxygen had been violently sucked from the room. The envoy had just demanded the king sacrifice his wife for a loaf of bread. Reginald rolled up the scroll, crossing his arms over his chest. Duke Sterling awaits your swift compliance, King Alaric. The winter is long, and the granaries of the north are remarkably empty. The choice is yours. Justice for the south, or starvation for your realm. King Alaric did not answer. He did not explode into the violent rage the court expected. Instead, he slowly turned his head to look at his wife. Queen Eleanor sat flawlessly still. The emerald velvet of her gown absorbed the light, and the sovereign star sat upon her head like a terrifying promise. She looked at Lord Reginald not with anger, but with the mild clinical disappointment of a woman who had expected a better class of enemy. Slowly, deliberately, Eleanor leaned forward. Lord Reginald! Her voice rang out, clear, cold, and possessing an acoustic authority that made the massive hall feel incredibly small. The envoy blinked, caught off guard by her calm. He expected tears, outrage, or desperate pleas to her husband. You have no voice in this negotiation, deposed queen! Reginald spat, trying to maintain his arrogant facade. I am the architect of this realm. Eleanor corrected softly, the sheer crushing weight of her confidence silencing the entire room. She placed her gloved hands flat upon the arms of her throne. And I do not negotiate with men who do not own the boots they stand in. She stood up. The great hall held its breath. It was a literal collective suspension of oxygen. as Queen Eleanor, draped in the heavy, sweeping emerald velvet of her gown, stood to her full terrifying height. The platinum and sapphire peaks of the Sovereign Star caught the stark winter sunlight streaming through the high windows, casting a halo of fractured icy light around her. She did not rush. A true monarch never rushes. Eleanor descended the marble steps of the royal dais, with the slow, predatory grace of a lioness stepping into a cage of frantic, bleating sheep. The heavy rustle of her skirts against the stone was the only sound in the cavernous room, a dark, rhythmic whisper that seemed to count down the final seconds of House Sterling's existence. Lord Reginald's patronizing sneer began to slip. The gold chains around his thick neck suddenly seemed to weigh much more than they had a moment ago. He tried to stand taller, trying to project the formidable authority of his 200 blockading ships, but the sheer crushing gravity of the Queen's presence was violently forcing him into submission. Eleanor stopped precisely 3 feet away from the envoy. She looked at him, not as a political rival, but as a minor, slightly irritating accounting error that she was about to correct. "You speak of wealth, Lord Reginald." Eleanor began, her voice a smooth, lethal ribbon of silk winding its way around the terrified court. "You parade into my husband's hall wearing burnt orange silk that you cannot afford wearing gold chains forged from borrowed metal, and you threaten to starve my people based on an illusion." Reginald swallowed hard, a bead of sweat breaking out on his brow despite the freezing air of the hall. "An illusion? The Southern Fleet is no illusion, Your Majesty. The grain rotting in our holds while your northern peasants freeze is no illusion. Duke Sterling's power is absolute." "Duke Sterling's power," Eleanor corrected softly, her obsidian eyes locking onto his, "is a fragile house of cards built on a foundation of monumental debt." She did not break eye contact with the trembling envoy, as she raised her right hand, snapping her gloved fingers once. The sound echoed sharply off the vaulted ceilings. From the shadows behind the royal dais, the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard emerged. He did not carry the worn, sea-stained ledgers of the royal treasury this time. He carried a massive singular tome bound in cracked black dragon leather. Resting upon the cover was a heavy, rusted iron lock bearing the crossed key and gold coin sigil. A collective shuddering gasp rippled through the older, more experienced lords in the room. Lord Vance's eyes widened to the size of saucers. Every nobleman who managed a treasury recognized that terrifying seal. Asterisk, the Iron Bank of the Free Cities. The Lord Commander marched down the center aisle, his heavy armored boots ringing against the marble. He stopped beside Queen Eleanor, turning the heavy ledger so that the iron seal was presented directly to Lord Reginald. Reginald stared at the black book. All the color rapidly drained from his flushed face, leaving him a sickly grayish white. His lips parted, but no sound came out. "For 15 years," Eleanor's voice projected across the silent hall, carrying the devastating weight of a judge delivering a death sentence. "Your duke has cultivated the image of a god of commerce. He built a magnificent fleet of 200 galleons. He expanded his ports. He dressed his daughter in diamonds, and whispered into her ear that her wealth made her fit to steal my throne." Eleanor took a slow step closer to Reginald, invading his space entirely. The envoy instinctively flinched backward. "But gods do not beg for coin in the dark," the Queen whispered, her voice a chilling caress. "To build his empire, Duke Sterling mortgaged every single cobblestone, every ship's mast, and every acre of arable land in the Southern Isles to the Iron Bank. His debt is so catastrophic, so unimaginably vast, that the interest alone could bankrupt 3 lesser kingdoms." This is a fabrication," Reginald stammered, his voice cracking violently. The arrogant boom was entirely gone, replaced by the reedy squeak of a cornered rat. "The Iron Bank's records are sealed. You cannot possibly know the terms of his grace's—" "I know the terms, Reginald," Eleanor interrupted, her tone turning to absolute ice, "because I own them." She turned slightly, extending her hand toward the dais. King Alaric rose from his throne. The terrifying warrior king, who had sat in absolute calculating silence for the entire morning, finally moved. He descended the steps holding a thick roll of parchment sealed with heavy black wax. He walked to his wife's side, turning his broad, armored shoulder to the envoy, and placed the parchment into Eleanor's waiting hand. Eleanor held the document up. She did not break the seal. She merely let the heavy black wax of the iron bank hang in the air for Reginald and the entire court to see. "While you and your duke believed I was weeping in exile," Eleanor proclaimed, her voice soaring, ringing with unquestionable sovereign triumph. "I was negotiating with the magisters across the narrow sea. I utilized the royal treasury surplus combined with the ancestral wealth of my own bloodline, and I bought Duke Sterling's debt in its entirety." The great hall plunged into a silence so profound, it felt as though the world had stopped spinning. The magnitude of her words crashed over the nobility like a physical wave. "You do not command a blockade against the Crown Lord Reginald," Eleanor stated, dropping her voice to a deadly intimate whisper that echoed in the deadly quiet. "Because Duke Sterling does not own those 200 ships, I do. He does not own the grain in their holds, I do. He does not even own the extravagant silk you are currently sweating through. The Crown holds absolute dominion over the assets, lands, and titles of House Sterling due to catastrophic default." Reginald's knees gave out. He did not kneel in a shallow, insulting nod, as he had done upon his entry. He collapsed. The heavy gold chains around his neck clattered loudly against the marble floor, as he crumpled to his hands and knees before the Queen. He was gasping for air, his mind entirely unable to process the total instantaneous annihilation of his Duke's empire. "So let us review the Duke's ultimatum," Eleanor said, softly, looking down at the broken man, shivering at her feet. She began to slowly pace around him, her emerald skirts brushing against his trembling arms. "He demands the release of his daughter, the traitor Duchess Seraphina." Eleanor noted her tone conversational, but dripping with venom. "A woman who is currently rotting in the black cells, and will remain there until her execution. He demands an apology from the Crown, and he demands that I strip myself of the Sovereign's star and exile myself to the Silent Sisters." Eleanor stopped in front of the kneeling envoy. She looked down at him with an expression of absolute terrifying pity. "Tell your Duke," Eleanor commanded, her voice dropping into a chilling register that made the blood freeze in the veins of every lord present, "that I respectfully decline his terms. I am not exiling myself, Lord Reginald. I am foreclosing on the Southern Isles." A spontaneous, involuntary gasp of pure shock erupted from the nobility, followed immediately by the sound of 300 lords and ladies scrambling to drop to their knees. The eastern lords, the northern barons, the ministers, and the emissaries all fell to the floor in perfect unison. They bowed their heads, their foreheads practically touching the freezing marble. They were not kneeling out of protocol. They were kneeling out of absolute profound terror and unfiltered awe. They had witnessed the king threaten them with a sword. But the Queen had just conquered the wealthiest province in the empire without spilling a single drop of blood. King Alaric looked out over the sea of bowed heads. His chest swelled with a fierce, possessive pride that bordered on violent. He looked at his wife, standing there in her emerald velvet and ancient platinum, the absolute master of the realm. Alaric drew his Valerian broadsword. The hiss of the steel leaving its scabbard was like a scream in the quiet hall. Lord Reginald, still grovelling on the floor, whimpered and pressed his face against the stone, expecting the blade to fall upon his neck. But Alaric did not strike the envoy. He pointed the massive sword toward the heavy bronze doors of the great hall. "Lord Commander!" Alaric's voice boomed, a terrifying roar of unleashed royal authority. "Your Majesty!" The Lord Commander of the King's Guard snapped to attention, saluting with a mailed fist over his heart. "Assemble 3,000 men of the royal vanguard immediately!" Alaric ordered, his icy eyes blazing with the fire of a conqueror. "You will ride south down the King's Road. You will arrive at the southern ports bearing the seal of Queen Eleanor and the deed to the Sterling estate." Alaric stepped forward, his heavy boots shaking the floorboards until he was standing over the whimpering form of Lord Reginald. "You will seize the 200 galleons of the Southern Fleet in the name of the Crown." Alaric continued, his voice ringing with absolute finality. "You will offload the winter grain and distribute it to the outer provinces. If any man bearing the Sterling crest attempts to stop you, if any dockmaster or captain attempts to raise a sword against the Queen's property, you will burn them alive on their own docks and hang their ashes from the mast." "It shall be done, my king," the Lord Commander shouted. He spun on his heel and marched from the hall, the heavy doors slamming open to allow him to execute the Crown's wrath. Alaric looked down at Reginald. He placed the heavy steel tip of his broadsword under the envoy's trembling chin, forcing the man to look up at him. "As for you," Alaric sneered, his lip curling in disgust, "you will ride back to your ruined duke. You will tell him that his fleet is gone, his lands are forfeit, his gold belongs to my wife. And you will tell him that if he ever sends a raven to my castle making demands again, I will not send my king's guard. I will come myself, and I will take his head." Alaric withdrew the sword, sheathing it with a violent metallic snap. "Get out of my sight!" Reginald scrambled to his feet, slipping frantically on the marble floor. He did not attempt to bow. He did not attempt to save his dignity. He turned and ran from the great hall, his heavy gold chains clanking like the shackles of a condemned man, his orange silk snapping in the freezing wind as he fled the terrifying presence of the king and queen. Eleanor watched the envoy flee. The tension in her shoulders, the coiled mathematical spring that had kept her entirely focused for the past 72 hours finally began to unwind. She looked out at the kneeling court. Not a single noble dared to look up. They remained perfectly still, frozen in their absolute submission. "Rise, my lords," Eleanor said softly. The court slowly clambered back to their feet. They looked at the queen with a new permanent understanding. She was not a delicate flower who had returned from a temporary exile. She was the architect of their survival, the master of their ledgers, and a sovereign so dangerously brilliant that to cross her was to invite absolute generational ruin. Lord Vance stepped forward, bowing deeply once more. "Your Majesty, the grain. Our people will survive the winter." "Your people will feast, Lord Vance," Eleanor assured him, her voice finally warming just a fraction. "The crown provides for those who remain loyal. Let the Southern Lords serve as a reminder. Treason is an incredibly expensive habit, one that none of you can afford." She turned to Alaric. The terrifying king of the Winter Realm looked at her with a devotion so intense it was almost blinding. He offered his arm to her. Eleanor placed her hand resting upon his thick forearm. Together perfectly in sync, the sword and the ledger, the king and the queen of the Winter Realm turned and ascended the steps back to their thrones. The crisis had not just been averted. The trap had snapped shut, breaking the bones of their greatest rival and securing the financial and military future of the kingdom for 100 years to come. The court bowed once more as the king and queen took their seats. The music from the gallery, which had been silent for an hour, cautiously began to play again, a slow, majestic cellos piece that sounded less like a banquet tune and more like a victory march. But down in the suffocating darkness of the black cells, the victory march could not be heard. There was only the monotonous dripping of freezing water and the terrifying, encroaching realization of an ending. Time is an abstract concept in the black cells beneath Winterbourne Palace. There is no sun to mark the days, no moon to signal the nights. There is only the agonizing, rhythmic dripping of lake water through the porous stone and the creeping, suffocating cold that slowly eats away at the mind before it finishes with the body. For what might have been 5 days, or perhaps 5 weeks, former Duchess Seraphina existed in this lightless purgatory. She had stopped screaming threats at the guards long ago. The biting frost had ruined her vocal cords, leaving her with nothing but a raw, pathetic wheeze. She huddled in the corner of her cell, the ruined, filthy remnants of her crimson velvet gown wrapped around her emaciated frame like a burial shroud. She was starving, shivering, and entirely alone. Yet deep within the fractured remnants of her mind, a solitary, desperate ember of hope continued to burn. Asterisk, he will come, asterisk, she repeated to herself, a manic mantra whispered in the dark. Asterisk, my father will come. He will starve them out. He will break the gates. He will put a crown on my head. When the heavy iron in the lock of her cell finally screeched open, grinding violently against the rusted hinges, the sudden influx of torchlight blinded her. Seraphina scrambled backward, throwing her bruised, filthy hands over her face. She waited for the sound of her father's booming voice, or the triumphant shout of southern soldiers coming to liberate their future queen. Instead, she heard the smooth, terrifying rustle of heavy winter silk. As her eyes painfully adjusted to the light, the silhouette in the doorway materialized. It was not a savior. It was the architect of her destruction. Queen Eleanor stood on the threshold. She was dressed for the freezing temperatures of the upper castle, wearing a majestic structured coat of obsidian wool, heavily embroidered with the silver wolves of the royal house. The sovereign star was absent from her brow, replaced by a simple, elegant circlet of Valerian steel. She did not need the massive crown to project authority anymore. The authority radiated from her very bones. Flanking the Queen was the Lord Commander of the King's Guard, holding a flickering torch, and a royal scribe carrying a single heavy piece of parchment sealed with a broken glob of burnt orange wax. "Has the winter finally broken you, Seraphina?" Eleanor asked, her voice an eerily calm melody echoing in the damp, rotting cell. Seraphina lowered her hands. She looked up at the Queen, her sunken green eyes wide and frantic. "My father," she croaked, her voice cracking pitifully. "Where is he? Did you surrender?" Eleanor did not smile. She did not mock the prisoner. She merely looked at the wretched creature on the floor with the cold, detached finality of an executioner stepping onto the block. "Your father is currently sitting in his empty estate in the Southern Isles," Eleanor informed her, her tone conversational, yet utterly devoid of warmth. "He is likely drinking cheap ale, considering his wine cellars were seized by the Crown 3 days ago, along with his 200 ships." Seraphina shook her head violently, pressing her back against the freezing stone wall. "No, no, that is a lie. You cannot seize the fleet. The Iron Bank..." "The Iron Bank transferred the deeds to my name the moment your father defaulted, which occurred precisely when I froze his remaining assets," Eleanor corrected smoothly. She stepped fully into the cell, the heavy wool of her coat brushing against the filthy straw. "The siege is over, Seraphina. It never truly began. Your father's soldiers laid down their weapons the moment the royal vanguard arrived with the ledgers. They chose to keep their heads rather than fight for a bankrupt duke." "He would not abandon me!" Seraphina shrieked, a sudden desperate surge of adrenaline fueling her ruined voice. "I am his heir. I am his blood. He would burn the world for me." Eleanor turned her head slightly, gesturing to the scribe. "Read it." The scribe stepped forward, unrolling the parchment. He cleared his throat, his voice ringing out in the cramped, miserable space. "By the decree of the Crown and the sworn written submission of Lord Reginald, acting on behalf of House Sterling." The scribe read the official legal terminology sounding absurdly formal in the dungeon. "Duke Sterling hereby surrenders all claims to the southern ports, the grain fleet, and the coastal diamond mines. In exchange for his life and a meager pension to be lived out in absolute exile, the Duke formally severs all ties to the prisoner known as Seraphina." Seraphina stopped breathing. The manic ember of hope in her chest flickered, and violently died. "Furthermore," the scribe continued, mercilessly delivering the final blow, "Duke Sterling officially strips the prisoner of the Sterling name, formally declaring her a bastard of the realm, and leaves her entirely to the mercy of King Alaric and Queen Eleanor to face the penalty for high treason." The scribe rolled the parchment up, stepping back into the shadows of the corridor. The silence that followed was heavier than the ocean. Seraphina stared at the rolled parchment in the scribe's hand. Her mind simply refused to process the words. Stripped of her name, declared a bastard, abandoned to the executioner. Her father had not burned the world for her. He had traded her life for a pension and a pulse. Slowly, the reality of her total, absolute annihilation crashed over her. She did not scream. She did not thrash or curse. She simply folded in on herself, curling into a tight, trembling ball on the wet straw. A low, hollow sound escaped her throat, the sound of a human soul breaking beyond the point of repair. "You believed that power was something you could wear like a crimson dress or a stolen diamond collar," Eleanor said, softly looking down at the broken woman. "You believed that plotting in the shadows and whispering poison into the ears of greedy men made you a player in the Game of Thrones." Eleanor knelt a shocking gesture until she was at eye level with the shivering, weeping creature. "But you fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the crown, Seraphina," the Queen whispered, her dark eyes locking onto the Duchess's terrified, tear-streaked face. "The crown is not a prize to be won. It is a terrifying crushing weight. It requires you to make choices that would shatter ordinary minds. It requires you to understand that blood is cheap, but leverage is absolute. Your father understood leverage. When forced to choose between his own neck and his ambitious daughter, he chose the ledger over love." Eleanor stood up, dusting a stray piece of straw from her pristine obsidian coat. "You are no longer a duchess," Eleanor proclaimed, her voice turning to pure freezing steel. "You are no longer a Sterling. You are simply a traitor who tried to steal a kingdom from a woman who built it." Eleanor turned her back and walked out of the cell. "Your Majesty," Seraphina gasped, throwing herself forward, her filthy hands desperately clawing at the hem of Eleanor's coat. "Please, mercy, I will serve you. I will scrub the floors. Please, I do not want to die in the dark." Eleanor paused. She looked down at the hand clutching her coat, then looked back into the cell. "The executioner's block is scheduled for tomorrow at dawn," Eleanor said, her voice completely devoid of pity. "Consider the swiftness of the axe to be the only mercy I will ever grant you." She stepped out of the cell, pulling her coat free from Seraphina's grasp. "Lock it," Eleanor commanded. The heavy iron door slammed shut, the rusted lock ground into place, and as Queen Eleanor ascended the stone stairs, leaving the darkness behind her forever, the final pathetic sobs of the ruined Duchess were entirely swallowed by the dripping of the Black Lake. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The following morning dawned with a brutal, blinding clarity. The winter storm that had battered Winterbourne Palace for a week had finally broken, leaving behind a sky of piercing crystalline blue. The air was so cold it felt like inhaling ground glass, but the sun shone fiercely, reflecting off the snow-covered peaks of the surrounding mountains in a display of absolute untamed majesty. High above the sprawling fortress on the grand balcony that extended from the royal bedchambers, King Alaric stood waiting. He wore his formal military greatcoat, a massive garment of midnight blue wool lined with the thick silver fur of a dire wolf. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, looking out over the sprawling courtyard hundreds of feet below. The courtyard was packed, not just with the nobility who stood shivering in their heavy furs, but with thousands of common citizens of the Winter Realm. They had gathered to witness the final act of the royal drama that had threatened to tear their kingdom apart. Behind Alaric, the heavy glass doors of the balcony opened. Queen Eleanor stepped out into the freezing light. She wore a gown of pure blinding white silk, heavily embroidered with silver, the traditional colors of victory and renewal in the Winter Realm. Upon her head sat the sovereign star, the ancient sapphires capturing the sunlight and casting blue fire across her flawless features. Alaric turned. The breath caught in his throat a sharp cloud of white mist in the freezing air. Even after all the battle they had fought both against their enemies and against the bitter misunderstandings in their own marriage, she still possessed the power to entirely render him speechless. He closed the distance between them, taking her gloved hands in his massive warm palms. He brought her knuckles to his lips, kissing them with a profound, reverent devotion. "It is done," Alaric asked softly, his voice a low, private rumble meant only for her. "It is done," Eleanor confirmed, her dark eyes entirely serene. "The execution was carried out at first light. Harrington and the nameless bastard of the south are gone. The realm is officially cleansed." Alaric nodded. A grim satisfaction settled over his rugged features. He released one of her hands, but kept the other firmly laced through his fingers. He gently pulled her toward the edge of the stone balustrade. "Then look upon your kingdom, my queen," Alaric murmured. Eleanor stepped to the edge and looked down. In the center of the massive courtyard, a massive iron pyre had been constructed. Piled high upon the logs were hundreds of banners, flags, and tapestries. They were all dyed in the burnt orange and crimson colors of House Sterling. The crests of the traitorous southern lords who had aligned with them were heaped into the pile like discarded rubbish. Surrounding the pyre were the knights of the King's Guard, holding blazing pitch torches. "Burn them!" Alaric's voice boomed over the courtyard, a commanding roar that echoed off the stone walls and rolled across the silent crowd. The King's Guard threw their torches onto the pyre. The dry wood and heavily oiled silk caught instantly. A massive pillar of roaring orange and yellow fire erupted into the freezing morning air. The heat of the blaze reached all the way up to the grand balcony, a sudden fierce warmth against the biting winter chill. The crowd in the courtyard let out a massive, deafening cheer. It was not a polite, courtly applause. It was a visceral, thunderous roar of survival. The people of the Winter Realm were cheering for the destruction of the traitors who had tried to starve them. They were cheering for the absolute terrifying strength of their monarchy. As the flames consumed the symbols of southern rebellion, reducing the arrogant legacy of Duke Sterling to nothing but drifting grey ash, Alaric turned to his wife. "They feared you in the Great Hall," Alaric said, watching the firelight dance in her obsidian eyes. "But looking at them now, they do not just fear you, Eleanor. They worship you. You saved them from a war they didn't even know they were fighting." Eleanor looked out at the cheering masses, watching the smoke rise towards the crystalline sky. She felt a profound settling peace within her chest. The brutal exile, the agonizing pain of their fractured marriage, the terrifying gambit with the Iron Bank, it had all been a forge. It had burned away the illusions of their kingdom, leaving behind only the indestructible truth. "I did not save them alone, Alaric," Eleanor replied, softly, turning to look up at him. She reached out, resting her hand over his heart, feeling the steady, powerful rhythm beneath the heavy wool of his greatcoat. "A ledger can outmaneuver an army, but it cannot inspire a people. They cheer because they know the sword of the Winter King stands ready to defend what the Queen has built. We are two halves of the same crown." Alaric's icy blue eyes softened, melting into an expression of absolute unconditional love. He wrapped his arm around her waist, pulling her flush against his side, presenting a united, unbreakable front to the world below. "Let the ash blow south," the king declared, his voice a low, fierce vow against the winter wind. "Let it blanket the empty ports and the quiet estates. Let it remind anyone who ever dreams of testing the walls of Winterbourne Palace." Eleanor leaned her head against his shoulder, the heavy platinum of her crown resting securely against his chest. She finished his thought, her voice carrying the chill of the ice and the unyielding strength of the stone. "That touching the Queen is a death sentence, and stealing her throne is simply an invitation to the fire." High above the cheering kingdom, as the ashes of their enemies scattered into the freezing wind, King Alaric and Queen Eleanor stood together. They were the architects of winter. They were the masters of the realm, and their reign had only just begun.